as we continue to cover what matters most to voters this election, the economy and inflation. We turn to April's CPI report, which is the inflation report. It's up 3.4% year over year and down slightly from March's CPI of 3.5%. Still not close to the target of 2%. So let's bring in Ted Thatcher, president of Bright Lake Wealth Management. Ted, good to have you. Have you noticed many of the mainstream headlines today paint a picture of inflation easing? But is that an accurate reflection of the whole story? The whole story, because inflation remains 3.4% higher year over year, just slightly down from March. It's been above the Fed's 2% target for 37 consecutive months now. So shouldn't the headlines read something like inflation easing slightly, but challenges persist, especially when we saw a surge in wholesale prices yesterday, the PPI Producer Price Index, highest in a year?
I think that you make an exceptional point. You know, I think that the word that was being thrown around constantly, Alicia, was, well, inflation is transitory. We heard that from the Fed over and over, transitory. Now, the word being thrown around is sticky. Inflation is sticky. It's sticky. Obviously, there was a peak last month when the March numbers came out, and that spooked everyone. And for whatever reason, I'm seeing a lot of, I guess, positivity almost in the headlines with inflation soothing slightly. But at the end of the day, the word remains. Inflation is sticky, and it's here to stay, it seems. Not to mention, of course, the way they calculate the CPI, the way they calculate the inflation rate has changed so drastically. Sometimes I think it's almost too different from what we see on a day-to-day basis. Certainly when I go to the grocery store or when I fill my vehicle up at the pump. If you look at what Larry Summers, the previous Treasury Secretary, released just a couple weeks ago, he did a calculation on inflation that included the way they used to run the numbers on the CPI, which no longer includes the cost of borrowing, a significant consideration for most Americans. And he says that the inflation rate didn't peak around 9%, but much closer to 20%, which at least to me squares much more with what most Americans are feeling these days.
Yeah, and Ted, has been going on for so long that for the first time in recent memory, parents are actually worried that their kids are not going to be better off than they are. They're not going to be able to buy a home. They need to choose between what food they can buy, what gas they can buy. It's just a sad situation, especially as voters head to the polls this November. They're worried about interest rates now. We need some sort of financial relief as we're not catching a break from housing, rent, gas, food. So with today's inflation report being above the Fed's target for so long, 37 months in a row, will we even see an interest rate reduction this year?
It's a really good question, because I think what you're really ending up highlighting is such the absolute discrepancy between what's happening on Wall Street and what's happening on Main Street. You know, we see headlines about market highs. We see, certainly the other side of that coin in terms of, young Americans starting families trying to get into the housing market. And of course, there is this unbelievable throughout this, dichotomy, I'll say, between what I outlined there. We also see the Fed being more and more of a politicized entity. And so you pose the question, are we going to get an interest rate decrease before the end of the year? And perhaps by the analytical measures alone, there's no justification for that. But there's a presidential election coming up. And I think with the political pressure, and if we combine that practical measurement with the futures markets and what they're telling us, is I think if I had to bet, for better or worse, I think that we may still get maybe a small rate reduction in September. That's what the markets are pointing to right now. Again, for better or worse, I think that means the Fed is, betting that Americans will swallow the proverbial horse pill of this doldrum inflation between 3% and 4% the way they measure it.
Okay, well, that's good news. I'm sure it'll make a lot of people happy, at least temporarily. You mentioned how there's a difference between what's happening on Wall Street and Main Street. How do these two different realities affect what the Federal Reserve decides to do ultimately?
Well, I think we're in an unfortunate situation, at least unfortunate in Jerome Powell's mind probably, because at the end of the day, what's happened the last 18 months is the inflation rate has really dictated Fed policy much more than Fed policy actually dictating the rate of inflation the way it ought to be. And so when we ask that question about how do we digest this circumstance we're in as Americans, I think that up until the point at which the unemployment rate unfortunately increases, we saw the jobs numbers lighten a couple Fridays ago, up until the data itself actually starts to show us that the Fed hikes have a negative effect enough on jobs growth, I think we're going to have to deal with the inflation rate the way that it is.
All right, Ted Thatcher, president of Bright Lake Wealth Management. Thanks for your time and insight today. Appreciate it.
For all our viewers asking where One America News is heading in the future, we would like to introduce you to OAN Live. OAN Live is the best way to stay up to date on all of the hard-hitting, straight-shooting, national and international headlines. And the best part is, OAN Live is only $4.99 per month. All the credible, honest, unbiased reporting One America News offers at a fraction of the cost of cable. Just go to OANN.com to easily sign up for OAN Live and stay informed.